The U.S. Army almost lost World War II without losing a single battle. Not because German tanks were better, not because American firepower failed, but because thousands of U.S. tanks stopped moving. By late 1944, the United States was outproducing every nation on Earth. Factories were running day and night. Ships were crossing the Atlantic in endless convoys. On paper, the war was already won. But on the ground, something far more dangerous was happening. American armor was vanishing, not destroyed, not defeated, simply abandoned. A thrown track, a snapped pin, one mistake in deep European mud. In seconds, a 30-ton tank became immobile. And in modern warfare, immobility was fatal. A tank that could not move, could not fight, could not retreat, and could not survive. These machines did not die to enemy fire. They died to distance, terrain, and physics. Every disabled tank became a liability, a target, a trap. German units learned to wait, knowing recovery crews would come back for the steel. And when they did, the real killing began. The math of war turned vicious. Weeks to build a tank, months to ship it across an ocean, days to move it forward, seconds to lose it forever. At first, the solution was unthinkable but necessary. If a tank could not be recovered, it was destroyed by its own army. Burned, disabled, left behind. Not because it was useless, but because there was nothing powerful enough to pull it out alive. This was the moment the U.S. Army faced a truth no general wanted to admit. Victory did not depend on more guns. It did not depend on faster tanks. It depended on something far uglier. Something heavy enough to drag steel out of the mud. Strong enough to defy physics. Protected enough to survive under fire. This is why the U.S. Army needed a 40-ton monster to win World War II. Not to kill the enemy, but to keep the war from collapsing under its own weight. If this hidden side of World War II matters to you, take a second to like the video. It helps keep these stories alive and tells YouTube to recommend them to others who care about real history. The dominant belief of World War II is simple and comforting. Wars are won by firepower, by better weapons, by superior machines crushing inferior ones, by whoever can destroy more of the enemy faster. By 1944, the United States believed this logic completely. American industry had become a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Tank production surged, shipyards flooded the oceans with steel. Aircraft factories turned out bombers and fighters at a pace that made Axis planners despair. From Washington, the equation looked flawless. More tanks meant more momentum. More momentum meant victory. But war does not happen on spreadsheets. It happens in mud, under rain, on broken roads, and in places where physics does not care who is winning. The deeper American forces pushed into Europe, the more distance began to work against them. Every mile forward stretched supply lines thinner. Every advance increased the cost of maintaining momentum. Tanks were no longer just weapons. They became moving investments, each one representing months of labor, shipping risk, fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. And yet, the battlefield did not care how much they cost. A tank could survive artillery. It could survive machine gun fire. It could survive enemy infantry. But it could be defeated by something far simpler. Terrain, a broken track, a failed suspension component, a single mechanical failure in the wrong place. When that happened, the tank did not explode. It did not burn. It simply stopped. And a stopped tank was worse than a destroyed one. A destroyed tank was finished. A disabled tank demanded attention. It blocked roads. It drew enemy fire. It forced decisions. Do you risk men to recover it? Do you delay an advance? Or do you destroy your own equipment and move on? As these immobilized tanks accumulated across France and Belgium, a quiet crisis emerged. Not one shown in newsreels, not one celebrated in headlines. The public saw breakthroughs and liberated cities. What they did not see were rows of perfectly usable tanks abandoned because there was no safe way to retrieve them. This was not a tactical failure. It was a systemic one. The U, as a D, S to B, Army had built an incredible offensive force. but it had underestimated a critical question. What happens after a tank stops moving? Recovery vehicles existed, but they were designed for a different war. Earlier conflicts assumed rear areas were relatively safe. Recovery crews worked behind the lines. Trucks pulled damaged vehicles off roads, not out of contested kill zones. In Europe, those assumptions collapsed. The front was fluid, the rear was dangerous, and the space between them was lethal. A recovery crew attempting to tow a disabled tank was often more vulnerable than the tank itself. Unarmored trucks bogged down, cables snapped under load, engines overheated. Crews were exposed to artillery, snipers, and ambushes. In many cases, trying to save a tank only created more casualties. As losses mounted, the logic of necessity replaced the instinct to preserve equipment. If a tank could not be recovered quickly and safely, it was destroyed by its own side. Charges placed, engines burned, guns disabled. Not because the tank was beyond repair, but because the Army lacked the means to bring it back alive. This was the contradiction no one wanted to face. The United States was winning the war of production, but it was losing the war of recovery. Every abandoned tank represented wasted effort and lost potential. More importantly, it slowed the pace of advance. Armored units without sufficient support could not push forward aggressively. Infantry waited. Commanders hesitated. Momentum, once lost, was difficult to regain. The belief that more tanks solve everything began to crack. What the U.S. Army needed was not another fighting vehicle. It did not need thicker armor or a larger gun. Those solved only one part of the problem. The real issue lay behind the front line, in the unseen struggle to keep forces operational. The Army needed a way to defy terrain, to retrieve machines under fire, to prevent progress from being dictated by mud and distance. In other words, it needed to solve a problem no enemy weapon had created. It needed a machine designed not to fight, but to preserve fighting power. This realization marked a turning point. Victory would no longer depend solely on what American forces could destroy. It would depend on what they could recover, repair, and return to the battlefield. Only then did the true question emerge. Why did the U.S. Army need something radically different? Why did it need something heavier, uglier, and more extreme than any truck before it? The answer lay in the simple truth that modern war does not stop when a weapon breaks. It stops when the system behind it collapses. And preventing that collapse required a solution unlike anything the Army had ever fielded. Once the problem was recognized, the U.S. Army faced an uncomfortable realization. The greatest enemy slowing the advance into Germany was not German armor or German tactics. It was geography. Europe was not designed for mechanized war on an industrial scale. Roads that had carried carts and horses for centuries were suddenly asked to support columns of steel weighing tens of tons. Fields turned to mud under constant rain. Forest paths collapsed under repeated traffic. Bridges failed under loads they were never meant to carry. For American armored units, movement was everything. Speed meant surprise. Momentum meant survival. But every mile forward increased exposure to terrain that punished weight and complexity. A tank did not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needed to stop. A broken track link, a damaged suspension arm, a mechanical failure under stress. None of these were dramatic events. There was no explosion, no fireball, just silence. And in that silence, the tank ceased to exist as a weapon. Once immobilized, the tank became part of the landscape. Mud crept up its hull, rain filled its hatches. Its silhouette turned into a landmark for enemy observers, and every hour it remained there, increased the risk of loss. This was the battlefield reality that contradicted the optimism of headquarters reports. While production numbers climbed, operational strength did not rise at the same rate. Tanks were reaching Europe faster than they could be kept in service. The issue was not replacement. It was recovery. Distance magnified the problem. Each tank represented a long chain of effort. Raw materials mined in the United States, steel forged and machined, engines assembled, vehicles tested, then shipped across an ocean contested by submarines, delivered to ports, transported inland by rail, fueled, crewed, deployed. That chain could take months, and yet it could be broken in seconds. As armored units pushed eastward, the gap between supply bases and frontline operations widened. Recovery vehicles had to travel farther, through more dangerous territory, to reach disabled tanks. The farther they went, the less protected they became. Recovery was no longer a rear area task. It became a frontline mission. This shift changed everything. Traditional recovery doctrine assumed safety. Unarmored trucks were acceptable when operating behind friendly lines. Crews could work methodically, attaching cables and towing vehicles without immediate threat. That world no longer existed. In the European theater, the front moved too fast. Areas secured one day could be contested the next. Recovery crews found themselves operating under artillery fire, small arms fire, and observation from enemy positions. A disabled tank was not simply a piece of equipment to be retrieved. It was a magnet for danger. German forces understood this quickly. They learned that abandoned tanks drew Americans back into exposed areas. Instead of destroying disabled armor immediately, they often waited. Recovery attempts became predictable moments of vulnerability. A tank that could not move forced a choice: send men to save it, or leave it behind. Neither option was acceptable. The cost of attempting recovery without adequate equipment was rising. Crews were injured or killed. Recovery vehicles were lost, and the tank often remained stuck anyway. The cost of abandonment was just as severe. Every destroyed tank reduced operational strength. Armored units without sufficient numbers slowed down. Infantry advanced without support. Plans stalled. This created a feedback loop. Slower advances meant longer exposure to terrain. Longer exposure meant more mechanical failures. More failures meant more abandoned vehicles. The system began to strain. At a strategic level, this threatened the tempo of the entire campaign. Modern mechanized warfare depended on continuous movement. When movement stopped, initiative was lost. And once initiative was lost, the enemy had time to regroup. The U.S. Army was winning battles but risking stagnation. What made the situation more dangerous was that it was largely invisible to the public and even to some planners. Production numbers masked operational losses. Tanks were counted when they arrived, not when they disappeared into mud or were destroyed by their own crews. But commanders in the field saw the pattern clearly. They were not running out of tanks. They were running out of usable tanks. This distinction mattered. A tank destroyed by enemy fire was expected. A tank abandoned due to lack of recovery capability was not. It represented a failure not of courage or tactics, but of planning. The Army had built its doctrine around offensive power. It had optimized for destruction, but it had neglected the equally critical requirement of preservation. As losses mounted, a grim acceptance took hold. Recovery under fire required a level of protection and power that existing vehicles simply did not possess. Sending lightly protected trucks into contested zones was no longer viable. The battlefield had changed, but the recovery fleet had not. This mismatch created an operational paradox. The more powerful American armor became, the more critical recovery grew. Heavier tanks were harder to tow. More advanced vehicles were more complex to repair in the field. Success increased dependence on systems that had not evolved at the same pace. The Army was approaching a limit imposed not by the enemy, but by its own logistics. At this point, there were only two paths forward: accept continued losses and slower advances, or fundamentally rethink how recovery was done. This was not a question of improvement. It was a question of necessity. The Army did not need a slightly better truck. It needed something entirely different. Something capable of operating where tanks failed. Something that could survive where recovery crews were targeted. Something that treated recovery as a combat mission, not a support task. The invisible enemy had revealed itself, and defeating it would require a solution as extreme as the problem. That realization set the stage for a radical shift. The next step was not about weapons or tactics. It was about redefining what counted as essential to victory. And that redefinition would lead to the creation of something few expected, few admired, but everyone eventually depended on. The U.S. Army did not ignore the recovery problem. It simply tried to solve it with tools that belonged to an earlier war. At the start, the logic seemed sound. Recovery had always been a support function. Trucks towed vehicles. Crews worked behind the lines. Speed and flexibility mattered more than protection. For lighter vehicles and safer rear areas, this system had worked. But Europe in 1944 was neither light nor safe. The primary recovery vehicles available to American forces were conventional heavy trucks adapted for towing. They were capable machines by peacetime standards. They could pull disabled vehicles on firm ground. They could operate on roads and in controlled environments. They were efficient, economical, and familiar. On the modern battlefield, those advantages meant very little. The first failure was power. Tanks stuck in mud did not behave like vehicles on pavement. They became anchors. Suction from wet soil could double or triple the effective load. Recovery trucks strained under forces they were never designed to handle. Wheels spun, engines overheated, frames twisted, tow bars snapped. In these moments, recovery stopped being mechanical and became dangerous. Steel cables under extreme tension did not fail gently. When they snapped, they whipped through the air with lethal force. Crews learned to stand back, but distance was not always protection. Men were injured or killed trying to save machines that refused to move. The second failure was protection. Recovery trucks were not armored. Their crews were exposed. On a battlefield where observation and indirect fire dominated, this was unacceptable. A stationary recovery operation attracted attention. Enemy artillery could range in. Snipers could wait patiently. What should have been a logistical task became a combat engagement, and the trucks could not survive it. Engines screamed as crews tried to pull under fire. Radiators boiled. Tires dug themselves deeper into mud. Vehicles designed to rescue others often needed rescue themselves. In the worst cases, a single disabled tank led to multiple disabled recovery vehicles. This compounded the problem instead of solving it. The third failure was doctrine. Recovery procedures assumed time. Crews were trained to work methodically, secure the area, attach cables, coordinate movement. But under fire, time was a luxury that did not exist. Every additional minute increased the risk of casualties. The reality was harsh. The Army had built a recovery system for a predictable environment. The European battlefield was anything but predictable. As these failures repeated, a painful conclusion emerged. The existing recovery fleet was not underperforming. It was fundamentally unsuited to the conditions it faced. No amount of bravery could compensate for inadequate equipment. Crews could not outwork physics. They could not tow heavier machines with lighter ones. And they could not survive sustained exposure without protection. This forced commanders to make decisions they hated. If recovery was too dangerous, it was abandoned. If a tank could not be pulled quickly, it was destroyed. Thermite charges were placed. Engines were burned. Guns were disabled. Valuable machines were deliberately erased from the battlefield by the army that had built them. This was not defeatism. It was triage. Every army accepts loss. But this kind of loss cut deeper. These tanks were not destroyed by enemy superiority. They were sacrificed because the system behind them could not support them. Morale suffered. Tank crews understood what abandonment meant. A disabled tank was not just equipment. It was shelter, firepower, and survival. Knowing that recovery was unlikely changed how crews fought. Risk tolerance dropped. Aggressive maneuvers were reconsidered. Confidence eroded. At the operational level, this translated into caution. Armored units slowed. Infantry advanced without sufficient support. Commanders hesitated before committing forces into terrain where recovery was uncertain. Momentum, once lost, was difficult to regain. The Army faced a contradiction. Its tanks were becoming heavier and more capable, but its ability to recover them was falling behind. Every improvement in armor and firepower increased the recovery burden. Heavier vehicles required more power to tow. More complex systems required more time to repair. Success magnified the cost of failure. This exposed a flawed assumption at the heart of pre-war planning. The assumption that recovery was secondary. In reality, recovery determined whether offensive power could be sustained. Without it, advances stalled, not because of enemy resistance, but because of accumulated losses that could have been prevented. By late 1944, it was clear that incremental fixes would not work. Stronger cables would not solve the problem. Better training would not solve the problem. Faster trucks would not solve the problem. The Army did not need improvement. It needed transformation. Recovery had to be treated as a combat mission. Recovery crews had to be protected like frontline soldiers. And recovery vehicles had to be built with a single purpose: pulling massive machines out of impossible conditions, under fire, without hesitation. This realization marked the collapse of the old approach. The belief that recovery could remain a support function died in the mud of Europe. What replaced it was a far more radical idea. If tanks were monsters of war, then saving them would require something just as monstrous, something heavy enough to ignore terrain, something powerful enough to defy physics, something armored enough to survive where others failed. The old solutions had reached their limit, and beyond that limit, a new kind of machine was about to emerge. By the time the old recovery system collapsed, the U.S. Army no longer debated whether recovery mattered. That question had already been answered in mud and wreckage. The real question was far more uncomfortable. What kind of machine could actually solve the problem? The answer was not intuitive. It ran against decades of thinking about mobility, efficiency, and support vehicles. The Army did not need something faster. Speed had never been the issue. It did not need something cheaper. Cost was irrelevant compared to the value of a saved tank and crew. What it needed was mass. Weight was not a disadvantage anymore. It was the solution. A recovery vehicle had to overpower terrain, not adapt to it. It had to resist suction, friction, and shock loads that crushed lighter machines. That meant weight pressing tires into the ground, creating traction where trucks simply spun. This alone pushed designs beyond anything previously fielded. But weight created another problem. A heavier machine became a bigger target. Recovery operations were already conducted under enemy observation. A massive vehicle without protection would simply attract more fire and die faster, so armor was no longer optional. This marked a philosophical shift. For the first time, the Army accepted that recovery crews were frontline assets. They were no longer mechanics working safely behind the lines. They were soldiers operating in kill zones. Protection became a requirement, not a luxury. An armored cab was not about comfort. It was about survival under artillery fragments, small arms fire, and shrapnel. Crews needed to work while under fire, not flee from it. Visibility would be restricted. Conditions would be brutal. But survival mattered more than convenience. Then came the question of power. Pulling a stuck tank was not a simple towing problem. Mud created suction forces that could exceed the tank's own weight. Jerking motions snapped cables. Sudden loads twisted drivetrains. A recovery vehicle needed immense torque, delivered smoothly and continuously. This ruled out conventional drivetrains. Standard drive shafts failed under shock loads. They twisted and sheared when traction suddenly changed. Engineers had learned this the hard way. Recovery under fire did not allow careful, gentle operation. The machine had to absorb abuse and keep pulling. Reliability mattered more than refinement. This led to design choices that seemed primitive by modern standards, but were brutally effective. Exposed chain drives, massive components, systems chosen not because they were elegant, but because they refused to break. Maintenance crews hated these designs. They were loud. They required constant attention. They flung grease and mud everywhere. But they kept working when more sophisticated systems failed. The Army accepted the trade-off. Fuel efficiency also ceased to matter. A recovery vehicle operating near the front would never be economical. It would consume fuel at a staggering rate. But no one measured success in miles per gallon. Success was measured in tanks, returned to service, and crews brought home alive. In this context, fuel became a consumable like ammunition. Expensive, but necessary. Mobility presented another paradox. The vehicle had to move through terrain that stopped tanks, yet it had to do so while towing even heavier loads. This demanded enormous tires designed to float over mud rather than cut into it. Suspension systems had to articulate over craters, rubble, and debris without snapping under stress. The machine would not be graceful. It would crawl, grind, and brute force its way forward. All of these requirements pointed in the same direction. The recovery vehicle could not resemble a truck. Trucks were built for roads. This machine would operate where roads no longer existed. It would be closer to a moving fortress than a transport vehicle. At this stage, the Army understood something crucial. This was not a support platform adapted for combat. It was a combat platform whose mission happened to be recovery. That distinction mattered. A recovery vehicle designed for safety and efficiency would fail. A recovery vehicle designed for survival and brute force could succeed. The Army chose the second option. This is where the logic of necessity overtook tradition. No army willingly builds a machine this extreme. It violates assumptions about logistics, maintenance, and transport. It strains infrastructure. It challenges doctrine. But the battlefield had already made the decision. The cost of not building such a machine was higher than the cost of building it. Without it, armored units would continue to bleed strength without fighting. Advances would slow. Crews would lose confidence. Tanks would be abandoned not because they were defeated, but because they were stranded. This was unacceptable. So the Army did what it had done repeatedly during the war. It abandoned convention. It redefined requirements. And it issued a directive that reflected the reality of modern mechanized warfare. Build a vehicle that can pull the heaviest tank in the inventory. Build it to operate under fire. Build it to survive where others fail. Everything else was secondary. This directive did not ask for innovation in the abstract. It asked for a specific outcome. Recovery had to become reliable in the worst possible conditions. Anything less would not justify the effort. The resulting design would be massive, awkward, and unapologetically specialized. It would not be versatile. It would not be efficient. It would not be admired for its looks. But it would do one thing better than anything before it. It would bring tanks back. In doing so, it would change the calculus of the battlefield. Disabled tanks would no longer mean permanent loss. Crews would fight knowing rescue was possible. Commanders would plan operations without fearing that terrain alone could halt an advance. Momentum would be preserved not by firepower, but by persistence. This is why the U.S. Army needed a 40-ton monster. Not because it was impressive, not because it was innovative, but because nothing else could solve the problem that threatened victory. The machine that emerged from this logic was not designed to win battles in the traditional sense. It was designed to prevent defeat by accumulation. And in a war measured not just in victories, but in sustained pressure, that distinction made all the difference. The monster was not a symbol of excess. It was a symptom of necessity. And once it entered service, the nature of recovery, and with it, the pace of the war would change permanently. Once the requirement was defined, elegance disappeared from the conversation. The U.S. Army was not asking for a better truck. It was asking for a machine that could operate where trucks failed completely. That single demand reshaped every engineering decision that followed. The first rule was simple. The recovery vehicle could not be treated as a civilian design adapted for war. Civilian trucks were optimized for roads, fuel efficiency, and driver comfort. None of those priorities mattered in a shell-scarred field under enemy observation. This machine would be built around function alone. The most visible decision was the cabin. Instead of a long hood and exposed driver position, engineers pushed the cab forward, directly over the front axle. This reduced the wheelbase and allowed the entire crew compartment to be encased in armor. The result was not graceful. It was angular, compact, and blunt. That was the point. Armor plates surrounded the cab, turning it into a mobile pillbox. Windows were replaced with narrow vision slits protected by armored shutters. When closed, the crew did not see the battlefield. They survived it. Visibility was sacrificed deliberately. Survival took priority. This marked a profound change in how recovery crews were valued. They were no longer expected to flee when fired upon. They were expected to continue working. The armored cab acknowledged that reality. Inside, conditions were severe. There was little insulation. Noise was constant. Heat from the engine radiated through thin bulkheads. But the cabin fulfilled its purpose. It kept crews alive long enough to finish the mission. Next came the heart of the machine. Pulling a tank out of deep mud required torque, not speed. High-revving engines were useless. What mattered was the ability to apply steady force without sudden spikes that could snap components. The solution was a massive, low-revving gasoline engine designed to produce relentless pulling power. It consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Efficiency was irrelevant. Reliability under extreme load was everything. Engineers accepted that this machine would never be economical. It would drink fuel in quantities that alarmed logistics officers. But compared to the cost of a lost tank and crew, fuel was cheap. Power delivery posed an even greater challenge. Conventional drivetrains were fragile under shock loads. When a stuck tank suddenly broke free, the surge of force could twist a drive shaft apart. Engineers needed a system that could absorb punishment without catastrophic failure. The answer was blunt and unfashionable. Chains. Exposed steel chain drives transmitted power to the rear wheels. They were loud. They required constant lubrication. They flung grease and mud everywhere, but they did not shear under shock loads. When traction increased suddenly, the chain simply pulled harder. This choice horrified purists. It looked archaic. It belonged to industrial machinery, not modern vehicles. But the battlefield did not reward refinement. It rewarded endurance. If a chain failed, it could be repaired. If a drive shaft failed, the vehicle was immobilized. The Army chose the system that kept moving. Tires were another critical element. Standard tires cut into soft ground, digging themselves deeper until traction vanished. Recovery demanded the opposite behavior. The vehicle needed to float. Oversized tires distributed weight across a larger surface area, reducing ground pressure. Combined with articulated suspension, they allowed the machine to crawl over terrain that trapped lighter vehicles. Rocks, stumps, craters, and debris became obstacles to climb over, not barriers to movement. The suspension itself was built for abuse. Flexibility mattered more than comfort. Components were oversized, designed to bend and return rather than snap. Every element was chosen with the assumption that it would be stressed beyond normal limits. Then came the recovery systems. Winches were not accessories. They were the mission. Industrial-grade winches capable of pulling tens of tons were integrated into the design. These were not gentle systems. They strained, groaned, and vibrated under load. Cables tightened until water squeezed out of braided steel. Failure was always a possibility. Engineers knew this. They built redundancy wherever possible. Multiple winches, heavy anchor points, reinforced frames. Everything was overbuilt because failure under fire was not an option. The trailer system completed the machine. Towing a tank was one problem. Transporting it out of the kill zone was another. The trailer had to articulate independently, following the tractor over uneven terrain without jackknifing. It had to accept enormous loads while remaining controllable. This created a machine that behaved less like a truck and more like a segmented organism. The tractor and trailer moved together but flexed independently, absorbing terrain that would destroy a rigid vehicle. Driving it required skill and coordination. Reversing under fire demanded precision. Crews trained extensively because mistakes could be fatal. The result of all these decisions was a machine that defied conventional categories. It was not fast. It was not efficient. It was not versatile. But it could do something no other vehicle could. It could enter terrain where tanks had failed, survive enemy fire long enough to work, and apply overwhelming mechanical force until the battlefield gave up its grip. This was engineering stripped of vanity. No effort was made to make the machine attractive. No compromises were made for comfort. Every feature existed because it solved a specific problem observed in combat. The machine did not pretend to be something it was not. It existed to pull. This philosophy extended to maintenance. Crews accepted constant upkeep as part of the job. Chains needed lubrication. Engines needed attention. Components wore quickly under stress. But maintenance was preferable to abandonment. Every repaired chain, every replaced component, represented another tank that could be saved. From a logistical standpoint, the machine was inconvenient. It was heavy. Transporting it across oceans strained ships and cranes. Roads and bridges groaned under its weight. It was not welcomed by infrastructure. But the battlefield did not care about infrastructure. It cared about momentum. Once deployed, the effect was immediate. Recovery operations that had been impossible became routine. Tanks previously written off were returned to service. Crews worked under fire with confidence that their vehicle could take punishment. The recovery mission was no longer an act of desperation. It became a calculated operation. This did not eliminate loss. Tanks still broke. Terrain still punished mistakes. But the balance shifted. Abandonment ceased to be the default outcome. This machine did not win battles directly. It did something more subtle and more important. It preserved fighting power. It kept formations intact. It prevented progress from being dictated by mud and mechanical failure. In a war of sustained pressure that mattered as much as any weapon, the monster was never meant to inspire admiration. It was meant to solve a problem that threatened to slow victory to a crawl, and by refusing to apologize for its weight, its appetite, and its brutality, it succeeded where refined solutions failed. The battlefield had demanded a machine without compromise. This was the answer. The true value of the 40-ton monster was not measured in how it was built. It was measured in what stopped happening once it arrived. Tanks did not suddenly become indestructible. Terrain did not become friendly. Mechanical failures did not disappear. What changed was the outcome. Before the monster, a disabled tank usually meant loss. After it, a disabled tank meant delay. That distinction reshaped how American forces operated. Recovery ceased to be a gamble. With a vehicle capable of working under fire, commanders no longer had to decide between risking crews or abandoning equipment. The decision shifted from, "Can we recover this?" to, "When do we recover it? Why?" That shift mattered more than it appeared. Armored units began to fight differently once they knew rescue was possible. Crews accepted risk that would have been unthinkable earlier. Maneuvers through difficult terrain no longer carried the same psychological penalty. A thrown track was no longer a death sentence for the machine or the men inside it. Confidence returned. At the operational level, this confidence translated into tempo. Armored formations maintained momentum because losses could be reversed. A tank knocked out of action for hours could be returned to service instead of erased from the order of battle. This kept units at strength longer. Before, operational planners had to assume a steady bleed of armor unrelated to combat losses. Every advance carried an invisible tax. Vehicles would be lost not because of enemy action, but because recovery could not keep up. With the monster in service, that tax dropped. The effect was cumulative. Fewer abandoned tanks meant fewer replacement shipments required. Fewer shipments meant less strain on ports, rail networks, and fuel supplies. The entire logistical system benefited from a solution that initially appeared to burden it. This was a paradox of scale. A single heavy recovery vehicle strained infrastructure, but dozens of saved tanks relieved it. Momentum, once preserved, fed itself. Infantry units benefited as well. Tanks remained available to support advances instead of disappearing between engagements. Combined arms coordination improved because armored support could be relied upon. Plans no longer had to account for sudden armor shortages caused by non-combat losses. This stabilized operations across entire sectors. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. German forces had adapted to the earlier pattern of abandonment. Disabled American tanks were treated as opportunities. Recovery attempts became predictable kill zones. Once the monster entered service, that pattern broke. Recovery vehicles that could survive under fire denied the enemy easy victories. Attempts to ambush recovery crews became more dangerous and less effective. The simple act of pulling a tank out of mud no longer guaranteed casualties. This forced German units to expend ammunition and effort for diminishing returns. A disabled tank was no longer bait. It was a temporary inconvenience. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. War is not only a contest of destruction, it is a contest of endurance. The side that can absorb friction without collapsing gains a decisive advantage. The monster absorbed friction. Mechanical failures stopped cascading into operational failures. A broken tank did not trigger a chain reaction of delays and shortages. Recovery crews operated with a margin of safety that allowed them to complete missions instead of aborting them. This reduced uncertainty. Commanders could plan more aggressively because they trusted the system behind them. Risk became calculable again. Terrain ceased to dictate strategy as brutally as it had before. The monster did not make mud irrelevant. It made mud manageable. This distinction defined its impact. Over time, the doctrine evolved. Recovery was no longer an afterthought. It became integrated into planning at every level. Routes were selected with recovery in mind. Units advanced knowing that failure did not equal abandonment. The philosophy of war shifted quietly. Success was no longer measured only by what was destroyed. It was measured by what remained usable. This philosophy extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Repair depots processed returned tanks instead of writing them off. Crews rotated back into action faster. Training investments paid off repeatedly rather than being lost with abandoned equipment. The monster multiplied value. It turned time into an ally. Every recovered tank represented saved effort, saved shipping, saved fuel, and saved lives. Over weeks and months, these savings accumulated into strategic advantage. This is why the machine mattered. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was heroic, but because it prevented quiet losses from eroding strength. The war did not turn on a single recovery operation. It turned on thousands of small decisions that no longer ended in loss. By preserving operational strength, the monster helped maintain pressure. And pressure, sustained without collapse, broke resistance faster than brute force alone. This was the difference between advancing and stalling. The WWII Army did not need the 40-ton monster to win spectacular victories. It needed it to avoid invisible defeat. And in a war defined by scale and endurance, avoiding defeat was often more important than achieving glory. The machine proved a lesson that would outlast the war itself. Modern warfare is not won by the best weapons alone. It is won by the systems that keep those weapons in the fight. The monster did exactly that. And in doing so, it transformed recovery from a logistical chore into a strategic asset. When the war ended, the 40-ton monster did not receive a parade. There were no victory speeches about recovery vehicles. No medals were pinned to machines that never fired a shot. History moved on, eager to celebrate battles, breakthroughs, and heroes with weapons in their hands. But doctrine does not forget what works. Long after the guns fell silent, the lesson remained clear. Modern war does not collapse when a weapon fails. It collapses when the system behind it cannot recover. The monster had proven something uncomfortable. Preservation mattered as much as destruction. In a conflict defined by scale, endurance was decisive. The side that could keep its machines and crews operational would outlast the one that simply replaced losses. This idea reshaped post-war planning. Recovery was no longer treated as a support function, operating safely behind the lines. It became a combat requirement. Crews were trained, protected, and equipped with the assumption that they would work under fire. Vehicles were designed not for efficiency, but for survival and brute force. The philosophy carried forward. Every modern armored force adopted the same logic. Heavier tanks demanded even heavier recovery vehicles. Protection once considered excessive became standard. Recovery assets were integrated into operational planning from the start, not added as an afterthought. The lineage was unmistakable. Modern armored recovery vehicles exist because the monster proved necessity. Their size, armor, and power are not excess. They are acknowledgments of a reality learned in mud and wreckage decades earlier. The doctrine can be summarized in a single belief. We do not abandon what can still fight. That belief extends beyond machines. It reflects how armies value their people. Recovery vehicles save tanks, but they also save crews. Every tank pulled back intact meant trained soldiers returned to the fight instead of becoming casualties or prisoners. Over time, the numbers added up. Lives were saved not by bullets fired, but by steel pulled free. Generations existed because systems worked when individual machines failed. The impact was quiet, cumulative, and profound. The monster's greatest achievement was not what it destroyed or even what it moved. It changed expectations. Commanders planned knowing that failure was not final. Crews fought knowing that help could reach them. Logistics officers built systems that assumed recovery, not abandonment. The war became less fragile. This is why the machine mattered. The U.S. Army did not need the 40-ton monster because it was impressive. It needed it because modern war punishes fragility. Victory in World War II was not secured by a single breakthrough or a single machine. It was secured by thousands of small decisions that prevented collapse under pressure. The monster was one of those decisions. It stood at the intersection of belief and reality, between the idea that firepower alone wins wars and the truth that endurance decides them. In the end, the machine carried more than tanks. It carried the future forward, and that is the real weight the 40-ton monster bore. World War II wasn't decided only by the weapons that fired, but by the systems that refused to collapse. If you value stories that uncover how wars are really won, subscribe for more World War II documentaries that go beyond the battlefield.